Welcome to the Stop and to Think podcast. I'm your host, Will Dole. Thank you for listening. Today, we are going over my annual top reads. This year, it's the top 7 reads of 2024. Subtitle of the newsletter post is I Like Books and I Cannot Lie. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy, you can rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. So this is a New Year's tradition-ish. This type of post. Last night, as we were talking about the past year with our kids and discussing things we want to learn and ways we want to grow in the new year, my 5-year-old daughter laid out a brilliant reading plan for me. She said, "Dad, first you read, then you sleep, then you get up, then you read, then you eat, then you read, then you eat, then you read." Thank you for that brilliant plan, Juna. If you too are interested in the Eat, Sleep, Read plan for 2025, then perhaps this post will be of at least mild interest to you. This is one of my favorite things to write every year. Maybe not the most beautiful things I ever write, but I love books. I love reading. I love thinking about what I've read. I love telling other people what to read, sometimes telling them what not to read. The annual caveat to this list, as it's got my own peculiarities. Every list is, in some sense, not completely arbitrary, but reflects the writer of the list probably as much or more than what's actually on the list. So in my top books, I never count rereads. I reread a lot of books this year. If I counted rereads in my top books, I would just have the same books in the list every year. And while there would be nothing objectively wrong with that, it would probably make for pretty boring reading. The books that I reread and much enjoyed land in the definitely worth your time section. So what I'm going to do is I have a little bit to say about each of these top 7 books. But then I'll just read through the list of other books that I thought were worth reading. That's all that's there in the actual newsletter post is just the title and author of the book. In this audio form, I may throw in a few words about those books as well. But here's my top 7, no particular order. Number 1. This may actually be a number 1, though. Shop Class as Soulcraft by Matthew Crawford. This is honestly one of the best books I've ever read. Crawford is a gifted writer. He's a clear thinker. Has a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago. I think he teaches. Maybe he's a fellow of. I don't remember what department he's in. Probably in the humanities at the University of Virginia. But he also owns a motorcycle shop. I think at this point he maybe does mostly fabricating particular parts. But his argument in this book, Shop Class Soulcraft, for the value of manual labor is particularly relevant in a world that honest white collar work up as far more important than blue collar work. White collar jobs have more cultural prestige, and his critique of this is insightful, at times cutting, and it is a joyous ride. The book is slightly dated in a few points. I mean, he wrote it 15 some years ago, but those areas don't bear heavily upon the central thesis, and in some places I think actually they might strengthen it. Book number 2 is Scattered Minds by Gabor Mate. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's a Canadian physician, and this is a really interesting book. When I reviewed it on Goodreads, I didn't really review it. I just said I was working on a review for this newsletter, and that still hasn't happened. I really need a long-form space to wrestle through some of his ideas, and I just haven't sat down to really flesh that all out yet. But this book is a dive into the origins and the cure of ADD, and it is a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. He's not coming from a Christian perspective, so there's things that as a believer, as someone who holds the Word of God, the Scriptures, 66 books of the Old and New Testaments as the highest authority. Coming from a different perspective. I mean, I could say that for a lot of books on this list, Shop Class of Soulcraft among them, but it's still very well worth interacting with Mate's work here. Number 3, Leaving Home by Garrison Keillor. Keillor is a fun writer. I've only ever read him really as part of assignments for some town and country training classes I do. And one of the professors is a huge Keeler fan, and so he throws Keeler in as one of our required readings as sometimes, and I enjoy the heck out of that. Lake Wobegon is such a relatable place. It's so true, even though it's set, 40 years ago at this point, and in a different state from where I grew up or from where I live, and yet those small town people that Keeler portrays they're real. They're real people. Sometimes fiction is truer than nonfiction. Number 4, Ordering Your Private World by Gordon MacDonald. This book probably had the biggest impact of any that I read this year. As someone whose private world is often characterized by chaos and disorder, this book was both challenging and practically helpful, especially the last chapter on Sabbath. I read this through slowly with a friend. We just would read a chapter or 2 or 3 and then discuss, and I found this book highly beneficial. I need to revisit some of the themes, at least go back through and look at my highlights and underlines and notes in the margin. Because I felt like after I got through that book and for a couple months afterwards, I was in a really clear headspace, and the things he talked about there were really beneficial to me. And as the year progressed and things got busy, I think ordering, especially maybe if you grew up in a chaotic environment and your mind is naturally a mess. But I think this is true for all of us in our distracted age with social media tugging at our attention. Very few of us have genuinely ordered private worlds. And so I anticipate this being something that I grow in over time, that I see progress and maturity in, but I don't see it ever ceasing to be a struggle and a fight to maintain order within. Book number 5. Speaking of order, book number 5 is Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. There was a man who had a very ordered world that he had created over the course of decades. I've made some half-hearted attempts to read all the way through Lord of the Rings in the past, starting when a friend sent me the books when I was maybe 12 years old. But I never got all the way through even the Two Towers, let alone Return of the King. But in late 2023, I decided that 2024 was going to be the year I was going to read through the series, and I am very glad I did. To be honest, Return of the King was far better than I imagined it would be. The whole series, like, I grew up watching the movies. I was a big Lord of the Rings movie fan as they were coming out. Return of the King was far and away my least favorite of the movies from the moment that it came out. I mean, we went and saw it in theaters. I was pleasantly surprised, blown away again and again by the genius and the joy of the book. The Scouring of the Shire, I understand how you don't have space to try to tackle that in a movie, but boy, the end of the book is just so much better than anything Jackson or anyone else has ever put in film. Boy, I really enjoyed the whole Lord of the Rings series, just marinating in Tolkien's world. Return of the King was a great book. Number 6, Life in the Negative World by Aaron Renn. This book is based on Renn's viral article from a number of years ago in First Things, The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism, where he divides American culture into basically 3 stages: positive world, neutral world, and negative world. And all 3 stages really are stages of decline in the influence and the presence of Christianity in terms of the cultural centers of the United States. But for the first couple days, his analysis starts, I don't remember the exact year, I don't have the book in front of me, but I want to say in the early 60s, early to mid 60s is when he frames positive world as beginning, and then that carries you on through into this is high quality radio, folks, into the 80s or the 90s. I want to say sometime around probably 1994 would be the cutoff point there. And then from 1994 until, I'm just using 94 as a number here, but I'm pretty sure it's right, 94 to 2014 is neutral world. So in positive world, even though Christianity is on the decline in the United States, what you see is it is still positively beneficial for you, even in influential places, even in the high places of culture, to be a Christian. And what you see in that time frame is things like sex scandals in politicians, like they could be career ending. And what you see in Neutral World in 94 to 2014 is the declining influence of Christianity. It's still not hurting you in public for the most part to be a Christian, but the cultural purchase of Christian ideals and values is much less. And so someone like a Bill Clinton is able to survive the Monica Lewinsky scandal and really not even be all that negatively affected in terms of his long-term reputation. And then post 2014, you come into a time when you have, not to push anybody's buttons here, but you have a character like Donald Trump who is all kinds of messed up sexually in terms of his morality, and it does not even have the slightest impact on how he's viewed by the old guard religious right. You see a big shift over the course of the past 60 some years in the purchase that Christian values even have in the minds of Christian people in American culture. And so what Ren's doing with Life in the Negative World is he's an analyst by training. Okay, he's not a theologian, he's not a historian, but he's trying to just give you a framework here to help you understand the world that you now live in. And he gives suggestions in the book for individuals as well as churches to help you move forward into the future with wisdom. So I think this is one of those books that leaders should read and probably anyone could benefit from. Number 7 on this list is The Surprising Genius of Jesus by Peter J. Williams. And Williams is a New Testament scholar. He's on the faculty of Cambridge. He does a very unusual, we might say surprising, thing in this book. He walks through the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, showing that Jesus' parables were not simply quaint little stories that he pulled off the cuff, but rather they demonstrate a mastery of Israel's history, the Old Testament scriptures, and the art of narrative teaching. And in doing so, he's pulling these things out and showing you that Jesus is not some quaint peasant from first century Galilee. He is a master, even humanly speaking, a master teacher. This is a really good book, well worth your time. Very small, short book, so not a lot of time required, but well worth your time. Here's a list of other books that were worth my time and I think would probably be worth yours. Father Hunger by Douglas Wilson. If you've never read Douglas Wilson and you're interested in some of his stuff on the family, this is the place to start. Start with Father Hunger. It's longer than most of his family series, but it's very good. The Lord's Service by Jeffrey Myers. I found that a beneficial book in thinking through matters of the church. Dispensationalism by Michael J. Vlock clearly lays out what are the key components of dispensational theology. So whether you are or are not dispensational, I think this is a very beneficial book to read just to have clarity on that topic. Well Met. This is a collection of poetry by Geoffrey Swaite. I found it quite fun. I really like Swaite's work. Painting is Pastime by Winston Churchill. A World Without Email by Cal Newport. Very good. I'm a Newportonian in a lot of ways. At least aspirationally. I need to put more of it into practice, but this was a good book. Not super applicable to a lot of my life. I'm not a white collar knowledge economy worker, but still helpful principles in there. Productivity by Douglas Wilson. I interacted with that book some in a newsletter post fairly recently. A Son to Me by Peter J. Lightheart. This is an absolutely brilliant look at 1st and 2nd Samuel. I read it when I was teaching through 1st and 2nd Samuel here a few years ago. Re-listened to it, and even just the act of listening to it, so that I was going through a little faster than I was when I was teaching through the books. Really good. Jesus, the Son of God by D.A. Carson. Again, phenomenal. Thin volume, but deep. Carson is one of those writers who doesn't take him a lot of words to say a lot of meaty, weighty things. A Primer on Worship by Douglas Wilson. The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien. Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton, just as fun as I remembered it. An Intelligent Person's Guide to Philosophy by Sir Roger Scruton. I've loved listening to Scruton talk. This was kind of a painful read. It was worthwhile. Like, his arguments are clear, interesting, but not the most lucid prose. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Getting into some classic poetry there. Very good. Monsters from the Id by Michael Jones. It's about the rise of horror themes in culture. Really interesting book, way longer than it needed to be. It's Good to Be a Man by Michael Foster and Benon Tennant. It was good. It wasn't great. It was good. To a Thousand Generations by Douglas Wilson. Probably the best argument I've ever read for paedo baptism. Didn't convince me, but if you buy all the way into covenant theology, I would see where you then take that all the way to the promises are to you and to your children. So worthwhile if you're thinking through that topic to read a strong paedo Baptist argument. Black and Tan by Douglas Wilson. The Household and the War for the Cosmos by C.R. Wiley. This was better. I read it at least once, maybe twice this year. It's a short book, but it's very good. Expositional Preaching by David Helm. Good, clear explanation of what it is and how to do it. Mere Christendom by Douglas Wilson. Made in the Image by Joffrey Swaite. This collection of poetry is better than the other. I listened to it, I think, last year and then read it. I love these poems. Untune the Sky by Douglas Wilson. This is also a collection of poetry. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage by Joe Rigney. This is an interesting book. Again, worthwhile if you're a leader, thinking through how to deal with the crisis of emotional manipulation that you are constantly subject to in almost any leadership role in our society. Becoming Your Own Banker by Nelson Nash. That was an interesting book. The Taste of Sabbath by Stuart Bryan. A good argument for Sabbath. He goes further with his application of the Sabbath principle command. He would say it's still in force. I don't agree with that exegetically, theologically, but Sabbath is built into creation and we need it. It's a gift from God. We shouldn't think through it, I think, as New Testament Christians as a command where we must obey, but it is a gift from God that we should receive with joy rather than rejecting it as ungrateful brats. A Basic Guide to Interpreting the Bible by Robert Stein. Still one of my favorite books on how to read and understand the Bible. The Green Ember Archer series by S.D. Smith. One-to-One Bible Reading by David Helm. Joseph and the Gospel of Many Colors by Vodi Bakum. Wild Life by Jackson Whitman. That was a real interesting one. Real choppy book, not well written, but guy lived a super interesting life. How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. That's a classic. Theology and the Democracy of the Dead by Matthew Jensen. He walks through and just picks out some key thinkers from Christian history and their contributions to theology. Good book. Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This is a classic for a reason. And Entre Leadership by Dave Ramsey. Not a world-shaking book, but a lot of good quotable lines in there, good principles. So if you want to see everything I read, you can go check out my year in books over on Goodreads. This was not all I read. My goal this coming year, 2025, is more modest than last year in terms of total books, though I actually anticipate reading more pages. I'm taking a stiffer course of reading. I'm going to read some more challenging books, some longer books. Hopefully, I will talk more about that in a later newsletter, a later podcast. What are you reading right now? Do you have a book you are particularly enjoying or that you enjoyed in the past year? Anything you're looking forward to reading in the coming year? I on the Substack post, I opened up the commenting for all readers, so you can head over there and comment there, or you can shoot me an email, contact@willdole.com. Yeah, I'd love to hear about the books that you're reading. Otherwise, this has been the Stopping to Think podcast. Thank you again for listening. I'm your host, Will Dole. Over and out.